They say the heart remembers what the mind forgets. But sitting across from the man I promised to spend forever with, I realized that forever is just a hollow word when he doesn't even know my name. It was our 3-year anniversary, and the table was set with a white linen cloth that I'd ironed until my arms ached, 2 candles flickering between us, and the heavy buttery scent of the garlic shrimp pasta he used to swear was the best thing in all of New England. I had spent nearly 4 hours in the kitchen, meticulously measuring out exactly 2 cups of heavy cream and a pound of fresh linguine, trying to recreate the magic of a night he no longer possessed in his conscious mind. Caleb sat 5 feet away from me, his eyes tracking the steam rising from his plate with a polite, distant curiosity that cut deeper than any physical wound ever could. He looked at me, really looked at me, and for a split second I saw a flicker of the man who once pulled me onto a small makeshift stage in a crowded dive bar just to dance to a song only we could hear. But then the flicker died, replaced by the hollow politeness of a well-meaning stranger who only knew me as his helper. "This looks incredible, Avery," he said, his voice smooth and kind, the same way you'd speak to a dedicated nurse or a particularly helpful neighbor you'd just met. "You really didn't have to go through all this trouble for a random Tuesday night," he added with a soft smile that didn't reach the corners of his eyes because he didn't remember the date meant anything at all. I forced a smile in return, the muscles in my face feeling brittle like dry parchment, and told him it was no trouble at all, just part of the job since I am officially his caretaker now. I didn't tell him it was July 27th. I didn't tell him that exactly 3 years ago, he had knelt on a rain-slicked sidewalk outside a greasy dollar-slice pizza joint in the city and promised me a lifetime of messy, home-cooked meals and laughter. Then came the question that shattered the fragile silence of the dining room and made the air feel 20 degrees colder than the New York winter outside. "I've been meaning to ask," he started, leaning forward slightly as he toyed with his silver fork. "Have we ever met before you started working as my caretaker? There's this strange feeling I get sometimes, like a ghost of a thought, wondering why you look at me with so much history in your eyes." My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird seeking an exit that didn't exist while I struggled to maintain the facade. I could see the vintage red guitar sitting in the corner of the living room, its strings dusty and silent, a relic of the vibrant life we had built before the black ice and the screaming tires of that rainy November night. I remembered the doctor's stern warning about not overwhelming his recovering brain, about the dangers of forcing a memory that his mind wasn't ready to reclaim yet. There was no guarantee his memory would ever fully return, leaving us in this permanent state of being strangers who share a bed. So I took a deep breath, tasted the salt of a tear I refused to let fall, and looked him in the eye to lie to the love of my life for his own sake. "No, Caleb," I whispered, the words tasting like bitter ash in my mouth. "We're just getting to know each other. But I'm glad you're enjoying the dinner." He nodded, seemingly satisfied with the lie, and went back to his meal, leaving me to mourn the ghost of us while he sat right in front of me, a stranger in his own skin, totally oblivious to the fact that every inch of this suburban house was a monument to a love he had left behind in the shadows of a broken memory. The silence in the dining room was not empty. It was a heavy, suffocating thing, filled with 3 years of conversations that Caleb no longer owned. I watched him set his silver fork down on the white porcelain plate, the metallic clink echoing like a gavel in a courtroom where I had already been found guilty of being a stranger. He wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, his movements measured and polite, a far cry from the man who used to steal bites of my food while laughing about how I always oversalted the pasta. My mind drifted back to a night 18 months ago, a night that felt like it belonged to a different universe entirely. We were at that tiny underground club on the Lower East Side, the air thick with the scent of stale beer and expensive perfume. Caleb was up on that cramped wooden stage, his fingers dancing across the strings of his vintage red guitar with a ferocity that made my heart ache. He had looked right at me, ignoring the crowd of 50 people, and sang a song he had written in the middle of the night on our living room floor. Back then we were electric, 2 souls bound together by a melody that only we understood. But now, as I stood up to clear the table, the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the distant siren of an ambulance somewhere 3 miles away. I walked into the kitchen, the linoleum cold beneath my feet, and started the faucet. The rushing water drowned out the sound of my own ragged breathing. I remembered another night, The one where we had walked 6 blocks in a sudden downpour just to get a $1 slice of pepperoni pizza from that hole-in-the-wall joint we loved. We had huddled under a tiny black umbrella, the rain soaking through our jackets, but we did not care because the pizza was hot and we were together. He had looked at me with grease on his chin and told me that as long as he had me and a $3 meal, he had everything he ever needed. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to push the image away, but it was replaced by the memory of a smoky bar in Brooklyn. Caleb had slid a 2-ounce shot of rye whiskey across the counter toward me, a mischievous glint in his blue eyes. He had leaned in close, his voice a low growl against my ear, and said that if I could handle that shot, I could handle him. I had taken the shot without flinching, and we had laughed until our lungs burned. That was the man I loved, the man who was currently standing in the doorway of the kitchen, looking at me with a confused, soft expression. "You know, Avery," he said, his voice hesitant as he leaned against the doorframe, "sometimes when the light hits the wall a certain way, or when I hear a car door slam outside, I get this feeling like I am supposed to be somewhere else. Or maybe I am supposed to be someone else." He walked toward the sink, stopping just 2 feet away from me. "Do you ever feel like you are living a life that was written for someone else?" I did not answer. I could not. I just kept scrubbing the same spot on the dinner plate, wondering how many more miles of lies I would have to walk before we reached the end of this road. 3 months had passed since the night the world went black on that icy stretch of Interstate 95, and every morning since felt like waking up in a house built of glass. Caleb stood in the center of the living room, his hand hovering just inches above the polished wood of the vintage red guitar that sat like a silent tombstone in the corner of our home. I watched him from the kitchen island, my fingers tracing the edge of a granite countertop that we had chosen together during a frantic weekend at a home improvement store 3 years ago, a weekend he had entirely forgotten. He turned to me, his brow furrowed in that specific way that used to mean he was trying to remember a lyric or a grocery list, but now it only meant he was lost in his own mind. "Avery," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight that made my lungs feel small, "I had that dream again last night. The one with the girl in the yellow dress by the lake. I cannot see her face, but she smells like the vanilla candles you keep in the bathroom, and she laughs just like you do when I tell a bad joke." The irony was a jagged blade in my chest because he was falling in love with a ghost of me while the real me stood right in front of him, pretending to be a paid employee. I remembered how we used to spend our Sunday afternoons at the park, sitting on a worn-out wool blanket that was exactly 5 feet wide, sharing a 12-ounce bag of pretzels and talking about the future as if it were a guaranteed map. Now the future was a dark room I was navigating by touch alone. "It is inappropriate, is it not?" he asked, stepping closer until I could see the golden flecks in his eyes that I used to count while he slept. "Falling for the person who is supposed to be helping me get my life back? My sister says I am smitten, but it feels like more than that. It feels like I am finally finding a part of myself that was buried in the wreckage." I wanted to scream the truth, to tell him that we were engaged, that we had already promised our lives to each other before the metal twisted and his mind fractured. But the doctor's words stayed me, a cold reminder that a sudden shock could derail his fragile progress and cause a permanent setback. So I did what I have become an expert at doing over the last 90 days. I looked away and tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear to hide my trembling hands. "We are just focused on your recovery, Caleb," I told him, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to stay composed. "You are just projecting your need for comfort onto the nearest available person." He did not look convinced. He reached out, his warm thumb brushing against my wrist for just a second, and a spark of electricity shot through me that was so familiar it nearly brought me to my knees. "I do not think that is it, Avery," he whispered, his eyes searching mine for a truth I was not allowed to give him. "I think my heart knows something that my brain is still trying to figure out, and it is telling me that you are the only thing in this world that feels right." The air in the living room felt like it was charged with static electricity, the kind that precedes a massive summer storm over the plains. Caleb was standing by the window, the late afternoon sun casting long, amber shadows across the floorboards that we had polished together a lifetime ago. He turned to me, a nervous energy radiating off him that I had not seen since the night he first asked me to be his girlfriend. "Avery," he started, rubbing the back of his neck in that rhythmic way that always signaled he was about to do something brave. "I know I am supposed to be resting and I know the rules about keeping things professional, but I cannot shake the feeling that I am wasting time. I want to take you out. A real date. No doctors, no medicine schedules, just you and me. My heart performed a painful somersault in my chest. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to say yes, to fall back into his arms and pretend the accident never happened, but the memory of the specialist's voice in the sterile hospital corridor echoed in my mind, warning me that his brain was like a house of cards and one wrong gust of wind could knock it all down. I told him we should stay in, that I could make his favorite sandwiches, but he stepped closer, closing the distance between us until I could smell the faint, clean scent of his soap. No more sandwiches, he insisted, his voice dropping an octave, becoming that low, intimate rumble that used to make my knees weak. I want to go to that pizza place on the corner of 5th and Main, the one with the flickering neon sign that says open in crooked red letters. I do not know why, but every time I close my eyes, I can taste the grease and the salt and see the steam rising off a hot pepperoni slice. I think it is important. It felt as if the universe was playing a cruel joke on me, leading him back to the very spots where our love had first taken root. I agreed, unable to deny him the one thing that seemed to be bubbling up from his subconscious. An hour later, we were sitting in a cracked red vinyl booth, the air thick with the smell of bubbling cheese and tomato sauce. The jukebox in the corner was playing a low, bluesy track that Caleb used to hum while he was cooking, and the vibration of the bass seemed to resonate in the very marrow of my bones. I watched the way he handled his napkin, a habit he had picked up from his father, and the way he tilted his head to the left when he was thinking deeply. Every tiny, familiar movement was a dagger of nostalgia. He looked across the table at me, the fluorescent lights reflecting in his eyes, and for a moment, the 3 months of silence and hospital beds evaporated. He reached across the table, his fingers grazing mine, and asked me to tell him about the girl in his dreams again. He said he was starting to realize that the girl was not a ghost at all, but the woman sitting right in front of him. He told me that even without his memories, his body knew where it belonged. He said that when I walked into a room, his heart rate spiked not out of anxiety, but out of a recognition that went deeper than words. I sat there nursing a soda I did not want, watching the man I had promised to marry fall in love with me for the second time. And I realized that the truth was a tidal wave hovering just off the shore, waiting for the perfect moment to crash down and change everything. I saw him reach into his pocket, his fingers brushing against something he had found earlier that day, a small velvet box he had discovered hidden in the back of his sock drawer. And I knew that my time as a stranger was rapidly running out. The velvet box felt like a ticking clock between us on the greasy table of the pizza shop, its deep blue fabric catching the rhythmic pulse of the flickering neon sign outside. Caleb did not open it immediately. Instead, he rested his hand on top of it, his fingers trembling slightly as he looked at me with a vulnerability that stripped away the last 3 months of pretending. "Avery, I found this in the back of my sock drawer this morning, buried under a pile of old sweatshirts I have not worn in years," he said, his voice barely a whisper over the sounds of the kitchen staff cleaning up for the night. I did not know who it was for when I first saw it, and for a few hours I felt like a ghost haunting my own life, searching for a woman I could not name. But then I saw you standing in the kitchen, illuminated by the morning sun, and the feeling of being lost just vanished. He slid the box across the table, the small movement feeling as heavy as a mountain. "I do not remember our past, Avery, but my heart is already writing a future with you in it. And I want you to have this because even as a stranger, you are the only person who makes me feel like I am finally home." My breath hitched in my throat as the weight of the lie I was living became almost unbearable. I remembered the night he had actually bought that ring, a Tuesday evening just like this one, when we had celebrated a small victory with $2 slices and a shared soda. He had promised me then that even if the world ended, he would find his way back to me. Now here he was, proving it without even knowing he was fulfilling a vow. I looked at the box and then back at him, seeing the man who had sang to me on a cramped stage with his red guitar. The man who had challenged me to a whiskey shot and laughed when I won. "Caleb," I whispered, my eyes burning with unshed tears, "there is something you need to know about that girl in your dreams, the one who smells like vanilla and laughs at your bad jokes." He leaned in, his gaze intense, as if he were trying to pull the memories directly from my mind. I saw a flicker of something new in his eyes, not just affection, but a sudden sharp recognition that made him gasp. It was like a dam breaking behind his eyes. He suddenly grabbed my hand, his grip firm and familiar. "The red guitar," he murmured, the words coming out in a rush. I was on a stage and you were in the front row wearing that yellow dress. We went for pizza after and then there was a bar. You took a shot of rye whiskey without even blinking, and I told you that if you could handle that shot, you can handle me. The words hung in the air, a perfect echo of a memory that was no longer just mine. He looked at the ring box and then at me, his face pale as the truth began to stitch itself back together. Avery, he gasped, the politeness of a stranger finally falling away to reveal the soul of my fiancé. I did not just meet you 3 months ago, did I? I have loved you across every one of these 50 states, through every song I have ever written. And I am not just falling for you now. I am remembering that I have never stopped loving you. The fluorescent lights of the pizza shop seemed to hum with a newfound clarity as Caleb gripped my hands, his palms slightly damp and his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and overwhelming joy. Avery, he whispered, the name no longer a polite label but a sacred prayer. I am so deeply sorry. I am so sorry for making you stay in that house like a stranger while I lived like a guest in our own life. The tears I had been holding back for 92 days finally spilled over, hot and silent, as I watched the man I loved reclaim the shattered pieces of his soul right in front of me. We left the half-eaten pepperoni pizza on the table, the orange grease congealing on the white cardboard, and walked out into the cool evening air of the city that felt more alive than it had in months. The 3-block walk to the car felt like a victory lap through a museum of our shared history. Every street lamp and every storefront seemed to be whispering a story we both finally understood. Once we were back inside the walls of our suburban home, everything looked different to him. He walked straight to the vintage red guitar sitting in the corner, his fingers brushing the dusty strings that had sat silent for so long, and a low resonant chord filled the living room, sounding like a bell tolling for the end of our long cold winter. He turned to me, the golden flecks in his eyes shimmering in the soft amber light of the hallway. I remember the doctor said we should not overwhelm me, he said, his voice stronger and more grounded than I had heard it since before the accident on the interstate. But they did not understand that being without the truth of you was the real danger. I remember the yellow dress now, Avery. I remember the smell of the lake on that humid July afternoon. I remember the feeling of your hand in mine when we walked through the park during that freak snowstorm 2 years ago. I reached out and touched his cheek, the stubble rough beneath my fingertips, a solid and real connection that no longer felt like a betrayal of medical advice or a lie I had to maintain for the sake of his recovery. You do not have to apologize, Caleb, I told him, the words finally free from the cage of my throat. I would have waited another 10 years just to hear you say my name with that look in your eyes. He pulled the small velvet box from his pocket again, but this time he did not just slide it across a greasy table. He got down on one knee right there on the polished hardwood floor we had picked out together, and looked up at me with a clarity that made the entire room feel like it was glowing. I will always love you, he said, his voice thick with emotion as he echoed a promise he had made long before the black ice and the screaming tires. Whether or not I remember every single second of our past, I know that you are the only thing in this world that is truly right. And as he slipped the diamond ring onto my finger, the metal cool and perfect against my skin, I realized that we were not just picking up where we left off. We were starting a new song, a melody that had been tested by the shadows of memory, and had emerged into the light, stronger and more beautiful than ever before. The first morning of our second chance did not start with a grand gesture. It began with the simple domestic sound of a coffee grinder humming in the kitchen, a noise that used to be the soundtrack to our everyday lives before the world splintered on that icy stretch of Interstate 95. I stayed in bed for a few extra minutes, watching the dust motes dance in the shafts of light hitting the bedroom wall, and for the first time in 92 days, the air in the room did not feel heavy with the weight of things left unsaid. I could hear Caleb moving around downstairs, not with the hesitant, shuffling steps of a patient, but with the purposeful stride of a man who finally knew exactly where the coffee filters were kept. When I finally walked into the kitchen, I found him leaning against the granite island, holding 2 mismatched ceramic mugs that we had picked up at a garage sale in upstate New York 2 summers ago. He looked at me, and the recognition in his eyes was so bright it felt like a physical warmth against my skin. "Good morning, fiancé," he said, the word rolling off his tongue with a practiced ease that made my heart perform a joyful somersault. He set the mugs down and pulled me into an embrace that smelled like peppermint and home, his chin resting on the top of my head just the way it always used to do. I spent so long feeling like I was ghost hunting in my own house, Avery, he whispered into my hair. But having you back is like someone finally turned the lights on in a room I have been sitting in for months. We sat together at the small wooden table by the window, the same table where I had served him meals as a stranger, and we began the slow, beautiful process of stitching our lives back together. He asked me to tell him the stories he still could not quite reach, the small details that did not make it into the highlight reel of his returning memory. He wanted to know the name of the song he was playing on his vintage red guitar the night we met, and he wanted to know exactly how many blocks we had walked in the rain before he finally worked up the courage to kiss me. I told him about the time we got lost in a corn maze for 3 hours and ended up eating $5 hot dogs at a gas station, and I told him about the way he always insisted on carrying every heavy grocery bag even when he was exhausted. With every story, the gap between the man I loved and the man standing in front of me grew smaller until it disappeared entirely. He reached across the table and took my hand, his thumb tracing the new diamond ring that glittered in the morning sun. I know the doctors said it might take time for everything to feel normal, he said, his voice dropping into that low, earnest tone that always meant he was speaking from his soul, but I do not need a medical report to tell me who I am anymore. I am the man who loves you, and I am going to spend the next 50 years making sure you never have to be a stranger in this house ever again. As I looked at him, I realized that we were not just recovering a lost past. We were building a future that was forged in the fire of a love that refused to be forgotten, a love that was stronger than any injury and deeper than any shadow of memory. The weight of the diamond on my finger was a physical tether to a reality that, just 48 hours ago, felt like a cruel fantasy. We were driving through the winding streets of the city, the temperature outside a crisp 55 degrees, with the windows cracked just enough to let in the scent of approaching rain and autumn leaves. Caleb sat in the driver's seat, his hand steady on the steering wheel, a stark contrast to the man who had looked at his own car keys with suspicion only a week before. He glanced at me, and that crooked, effortless grin that had first captured my heart in a crowded basement bar in Brooklyn was back in full force. "We are going back to where it all started," he said, his voice firm with a conviction that made the last 3 months of hospital hallways and sterile waiting rooms feel like a bad dream. We pulled up in front of the Blue Note Tavern, a dive bar with a neon sign that had been missing the letter E for at least a decade. The smell of stale beer and old sawdust hit us the moment we stepped inside, a sensory anchor that pulled another fragment of memory to the surface for him. I saw his eyes light up as he looked at the tiny makeshift wooden stage in the corner, barely 6 feet wide and covered in duct tape. "That is it," he whispered, grabbing his vintage red guitar case from the back seat. "That is where I was standing when I saw you in the front row, wearing that yellow sundress and looking like the only bright thing in this entire smoky room." He walked to the stage, the floorboards creaking familiarly under his boots, and sat on a tall metal stool. He began to tune the strings, the sharp metallic pings cutting through the quiet afternoon. I sat at our usual booth, the red vinyl patched with black tape, and watched as he closed his eyes and began to play. It was the song he had written for me, a melody that had survived the crash, even when the words had been lost in the fog of his trauma. The notes were rich and soulful, filling the empty bar with a resonance that felt like a heartbeat. As the last chord faded into the rafters, he looked at me, and I realized that while his brain might still have gaps where November used to be, his fingers and his heart had never forgotten a single beat. He stepped down from the stage and slid into the booth beside me, his shoulder pressing against mine. "Avery, I realized something today," he said, taking a sip of the cold ginger ale I had ordered for us. "The doctors were right that I might never get every single minute back. I might not remember what we had for dinner on our first anniversary or the name of that movie we hated in the theater. But it does not matter. Because when I am with you, I do not feel like I am trying to remember someone else's life. I feel like I am finally living mine." He leaned in and kissed my forehead, a simple grounding gesture that meant more than any grand declaration. We sat there for a long time, two people who had been broken and put back together, realizing that even in the shadows of memory, there is enough light to find your way home as long as you are holding the right person's hand. The morning light filtered through the curtains of our bedroom, casting a soft, golden glow over the diamond ring that had finally found its way back to my finger where it belonged. Caleb was already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed with his vintage red guitar resting against his knee, his fingers absent-mindedly plucking a melody that sounded like the beginning of a new chapter rather than the end of an old one. He turned to look at me, and there was no longer that haunting shadow of confusion in his eyes, just the deep, unwavering warmth of a man who had traveled through the darkest parts of his own mind to find his way back home. "Avery," he said, his voice a low and steady anchor in the quiet room, "I was thinking about what you said at the bar yesterday about how you would have waited 10 years for me. It made me realize that even when I did not know your name, my soul was still reaching for you in every dream and every half-remembered song." We spent the afternoon packing away the medical records and the pill organizers that had defined our lives for the last 3 months, tossing the reminders of the accident into a cardboard box that we tucked away in the back of the garage. We decided to walk to the park, the same one where we had shared those $5 hot dogs and gotten lost in the corn maze years ago. The air was cool, about 50 degrees, and the leaves were crunching under our boots as we walked hand in hand. Caleb stopped under a large oak tree, the very spot where he had first told me he loved me under a freak snowstorm. He took both of my hands in his, looking at me with a clarity that felt more permanent than any medical recovery. "I want to make a new promise to you," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that vibrated through my own chest. "Whether or not every single memory of our past comes back, whether or not I ever remember the exact flavor of the cake we had on our first date or the name of the street where we had our first fight, it does not change the truth of right now. I told you once that I would love you past the day that we die, and I am standing by that. I will be by your side even past our prime, and we will grow old and laugh at the times that we cried. You are the only thing in this world that I know is right." I looked at him, the man who had died and come back to life just to find me again, and I knew that our love was no longer just a collection of memories stored in a brain. It was a living, breathing thing that lived in the way he held my hand and the way he hummed while he made coffee. We walked back to our house, the suburban street looking brighter than it ever had before, and as we stepped through the front door, I realized we were not just finding love again in the shadows of memory. We were stepping into the light of a future that we were going to write together, one day, one song, and one heartbeat at a time. I looked at the red guitar in the corner and then at the man I was going to marry, and I knew that as long as we were together, we would always be home.